The Midrash tells the story of how Abraham's father Terach owned an idol shop. This was a place where he made figurines and people would come and offer sacrifices to the figurines and sometimes buy them. One day, Terach had to run an errand. So, he left teenage Abraham in charge of his business. A woman came into the shop and asked Abraham if she could give a meal offering to an idol. Abraham, being a rambunctious teen, then took a big stick and destroyed all the idols except for the largest one. He then placed the stick in the hands of the largest idol. When Terach came home, he looked exasperatingly at Abraham, perhaps like many of us have looked at a teenager who constantly subverts our authority, and Terach said, "What in the world have you done?" Abraham, ever the smart aleck, told his father that a woman came in to offer a meal offering to an idol. He told his father, then the idols fought over who would get the food first. So the biggest idol got up, took a club, and shattered the other idols. Terach became furious. "What, are you mocking me? Surely you know that the idols are not alive." Abraham had one final clever retort. He said, "Do your ears not hear what your mouth is saying?" Abraham was making the point that Terach's idol worship was foolish. If Terach didn't believe that his big idol could take a stick and destroy the other idols, why in the world would he worship them? From an early age, Abraham was the type of person who thought for himself. He realized he didn't believe in the idol worship of his father, and so he turned to the one God of Judaism. If we dig a little deeper, though, there's more to Abraham's life than an abstract dispute over whether there is one or whether there are many gods. As Rabbi Michael Lerner of blessed memory taught, Abraham rejected the idol worship of his father because he discovered that his father's idols weren't concerned about morality. The one God of Israel, on the other hand, our one God, is concerned about justice. The one God of Israel cares about what is right. Lerner then reads Abraham's life as a struggle between accepting the world as it is, with all of its injustice, and hoping for a better world. And the one God of monotheism is what helps Abraham hope for this better world. For the rest of his life, Abraham struggles between accepting the cruelty of the way the world is now and aspiring to create a better world. Sometimes he's overcome by the harsh world that surrounds him, and he gives in to cynicism. In one episode, he pretends to be his wife Sarah's brother and allows Egyptian courtiers to take Sarah away to Pharaoh's palace. In that episode, Abraham lost sight of what was right and instead acted according to the unjust logic of the world as it is. In Lerner's reading, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, which we just read this morning, offers another test for Abraham. On one hand, Abraham hears the voice of the world as it is, in which sacrifice is common. That is the impulse that leads him to nearly slay his son. But Abraham also hears the voice of the world as it ought to be, and that is the voice that leads him to spare his son. Now, I don't think the stakes are so mythological for most of us. Most of us don't talk to God on a regular basis the way Abraham did, and most of our lives don't involve pharaohs or child sacrifice. But it seems we all face the dilemma of the world as it is coming into tension with the world as it ought to be. Our Jewish belief that there is something more in the universe urges us to act on the world as it ought to be. We face difficult decisions every day when we shop, when we interact with people, and in all the small decisions we make. But what I most want to draw our attention to this morning is the grand scale, the churning feeling I know so many of us feel when we read the headlines. Now, I know many of us feel this, especially when it comes to the presidential election. This is absolutely a scary time, and there is so much at stake: democracy, decency, a woman's right to choose, our planet warming. Regardless of who wins this next election, it's clear that our country needs healing, that we are far from the politics we ought to have. We also feel a profound disconnect between the way things are and the way things should be when it comes to the war in Israel, Gaza, and the surrounding region. The loss of life in Israel and Gaza is absolutely heartbreaking. The prospect for the return of the hostages is dim, and daily life has become a nightmare for Palestinians. It's frightening to think about the direction the conflict has taken just in the past few days in the broader region. Thousands of miles away from the Middle East, and at least a few hundred miles from the nearest swing state, we can feel helpless. How can we possibly make a difference when we face these colossal problems? Even if we want to act like Abraham and listen to our sense of what ought to be, what can we do? Now, the rabbis who emerged after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem knew all about this feeling of helplessness. Before it was destroyed, the temple was the center of Judaism. This is where people gathered, where sacrifices took place, where the Holy of Holies was. A couple hundred years later, still reeling from the destruction of the temple, there was a sage named Rabbi Chisda. Rabbi Chisda thought about whether it was still even possible to bring holiness into the world after the destruction of the temple. How could Judaism continue if it had lost its core? Now, Rabbi Chisda offered a surprising answer. He taught that after the destruction of the temple, God only appears in the 4 yards of halakha. What does that mean? Halakha means the way or the going. Halakha is the way we ought to live our lives. It is the sum total of all the actions we take, given that we are called to something bigger than ourselves. The world asks us to live according to a high standard, and halakha is what we ought to do in response. When Rabbi Chisda said that following the destruction of the temple, God exists only in the 4 yards of halakha, he means that we can only know God through the actions we take in the immediate world around us. If we apply that to us today, for many of us that means starting with our families, the people we interact with every day at work or at school or in the places we live. It means starting in our neighborhoods, in our city, in this very synagogue. Now, I understand this can be an unsatisfying response to the massive problems I mentioned earlier, things like the election and the conflict in the Middle East. But I've been learning about a school of thought led by the Black activist Adrienne Maree Brown and others, and this school of thought is called emergent strategy. I wonder if this way of thinking can help us to understand the power of starting with the 4 yards in front of us. Like the rabbis, Brown argues that we should act in our immediate surroundings. She writes about how pockets of creating what ought to be, pockets of liberation, can add up to a broad-scale difference. Brown and the others who are part of this school of thought are by no means saying to give up on big systems. By all means, vote, phone bank, donate money, support organizations working toward peace. Still, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, another prominent thinker in the movement, offers an example of how this small-scale approach has worked. During the era of plantations and enslavement in what is now Jamaica, folks escaped captivity and became what was known as Maroons. They formed small communities in the hills that were all about a sense of care and connectedness. They protected each other, they shared food, and they looked out for each other. These communities proved to those who were still in captivity that there was a better way. Gumbs, the scholar, looks at journals of the enslavers and found that the alternative presented by the Maroons made enslavement impossible. Gumbs writes, "The idea that there were formerly enslaved people somewhere practicing freedom made captive plantation workers ungovernable." Emergent strategy thinkers take inspiration from biology and from math to argue that change takes place in the way fractals work. Now, fractals, if you recall, are shapes or patterns that begin small, but then combine to form bigger shapes that look the same as the smaller ones. The actor and lawyer Andrea Ritchie writes, "One of the core principles of emergent strategy is that complex systems are fractal, a fancy word to describe how small structures are replicated in larger ones. Broccoli is made up of tiny broccolis. Fern fronts are made up of smaller fronts. Snowflakes look like microscopic crystals of the water that they're made of. Patterns of our fingerprints appear in the shape of galaxies," and so on. In other words, we need to look to the smallest building blocks to understand and shape larger systems. Ritchie then quotes Adrienne Maree Brown, who says, "What we practice in the small scale sets the pattern for the system as a whole." For me, the most surprising part about learning about this approach has been how much it is joyful. Forming enclaves of how the world ought to be actually feels good. This makes sense. When we treat others well, when we are in communities of people who care about one another, when we are surrounded by love, we are happy. As Jews, we know a lot about the joy that comes from creating pockets of the world as it ought to be. Picture a Shabbat table. People put down their devices, sit around a table, listen to one another, eat and talk. It's traditional to sing late into the night, to laugh, to just be with one another. Sometimes we fulfill what the rabbis tell us is possible, and we get a taste of the world to come. It's true that we are all sometimes overwhelmed by cynicism. We can believe that things will always be the way they are, that a better way is only a pipe dream. Like Abraham, we struggle to bring into being the world as it ought to be. The predominantly black thinkers I've been drawing from are well aware of the horrors of the world. These activists are up against the most difficult problems in our society. They describe themselves as abolitionists, meaning they take up the mantle of those who abolished slavery and want to free folks from the carceral system. The communities they aspire to offer a radical alternative to the world around us. They create deep ties to prevent violence, they share money, they care for each other. For me, learning about these thinkers has actually been a huge relief. Creating better worlds doesn't always have to be heavy and painful. Instead, it starts with the joy of treating those around you well. I'm personally figuring out for myself how to create enclaves of the world that ought to be. I know I want to change the way I talk to myself sometimes and branch out more. I want to belong to communities that are more interdependent and loving. And I know that this isn't always an easy task in San Francisco in 2024, when folks tend to be siloed into their smaller groups and are often very busy and lonely. Starting with the world around us also means making the place we sit in right now as interconnected and loving as possible. Shereth Israel is at its best when we care for one another. In 5785, I challenge us to take this sense of care to the next level. Let's make our synagogue more welcoming to folks that might not look like most of us. Let's think more about what we can contribute to our synagogue community. Join our Hesed committee, which already does a wonderful job of caring for congregants in need. Volunteer at Hamotzi, get more involved. I encourage us all to give more of ourselves to each other, to begin to create the world we want to see right here. As we continue through this reflective time of the Jewish year, as we consider the ways we've missed the mark, let's think about how we can create a better world in our immediate surroundings. I encourage you to begin right after services. Introduce yourself to someone you don't know and strike up a conversation. If in the synagogue and elsewhere, we can build pockets of the world that ought to be, the 4 yards around us can join with others' 4 yards, then we can scale up pockets of care and dignity for all, the way a fern replicates itself from small to big. In the year 5785, may we do our profound and joyful best to create the world as it ought to be, starting with the 4 yards right in front of us. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will. Shana Tova.